Arboretum's program, Winter Tree ID with the Arboretum's horticulturist, Ryan Moore. I'm Mark Wolf, Executive Director at the Arboretum, and I'm delighted to have Ryan speaking for us today. I can tell you he's put lots of time out in the cold, hip deep in snow, collecting the perfect branch and bud to help us all learn. Ryan has been at the Arboretum since 2019 and maintains all the collections and trails, runs our volunteer gardener program, and fixes everything that breaks. Before coming to Mountaintop Arboretum, Ryan worked for a number of botanical gardens in New Jersey, but this Catskills was always calling to him, and we're thrilled he finally made it here. So I have some protocols, directions. Please post any questions for Ryan in the Q&A box, which I will monitor. And then if you have questions during the talk about a specific tree, we'll open up the discussion during the talk, and I'll feed Ryan those questions. If you have technical difficulties, I see somebody's already did something in the chat. Oh, it's a thank you from Winnettskill, New York. Oh, I don't know where that is. I'll have to Google that. So the Q&A box is for questions that I will monitor, and we'll go to Ryan. I'll ask them to Ryan. If you have technical difficulties, use the chat room, or if you want to chat, use the chat room, which I will also monitor. Please check out our website for upcoming winter programs. We should be posting programs for the rest of the year sometime in early spring. This webinar is free. If you'd like to make a suggested donation, which goes directly back into our programming, please visit the support page on our website, mtarboretum.org. Now let's all give Ryan a silent round of applause. Take it away, Ryan.
All right, well, thank you everybody for being here and for signing up for the program. The response to this was a lot more than I imagined it would be. So I'm gonna share my screen and we're gonna pull up the presentation. Let's see. It's kind of funny, I spent my entire life avoiding computers, and now I rely on them all the time. All right, so we're doing winter tree identification at Mountaintop Arboretum, and I'm the horticulturalist and program coordinator, Ryan Moore. And the way I've organized this is we're going to go over some key terms that you would use or see used in ID books and keys when you're identifying plants, particularly for winter ID. So we're going to look at some key terms. We're going to look at some pictures. We're going to get into tree ID of, I've got 13 different species we're going to go over. And if we have enough time, I've got a dichotomous key at the end of this presentation, and we can go over how to ID one tree through a dichotomous key using the terminology that we've practiced today. And without further ado, let's get into some key terms. And I'm gonna hide the little thing that makes me see my face because I can't look at myself. There we go, so much better. All right, so key terms. A leaf scar. It's where the previous year's leaf petiole attachment point. So you can see the leaf scar, or you can see the petiole over here. That's what a petiole is. And when that comes off, you'll have a leaf scar there. Now that's a Kalmia, so it's a broadleaf evergreen. It's not going to exactly do the same thing, but it has a petiole. So the vascular bundle, when you look inside a leaf scar, the vascular bundle shows the xylem and phloem connection that the leaf had. The xylem and phloem form specific patterns to each tree species. When you have a really large petiole, what you'll see on like an ash tree or trees with really large leaves, particularly sycamores, that's when those patterns can be particularly helpful. And say you're trying to ID between different hickories in a forest, being able to look at those leaf scars and the vascular bundles can be helpful. With really tiny twigs, it's really hard to see the leaf scar. You probably need a hand lens or something else. Seasonal growth. You can ID a tree's seasonal growth by following from the tip of the twig back to a ring of scars that goes all the way around the twig. and this indicates the previous season's terminal bud scales. We'll go over those now. The bud scales cover and protect next year's tiny preformed leaves. Inside a bud are actually tiny preformed leaves, and those bud scales protect it for winter. What I didn't put in this presentation is that mainly a few shrubs I'm familiar with, have naked buds where they just have next year's tiny preformed leaves clinging to that twig unprotected through winter. Particularly, you'll see this in some viburnum species. Now, something that's sort of very common and very useful when you're IDing trees is a branching habit. And there's basically three that we're really going to be looking at. Two really for this presentation. You have opposite branching, and that is where leaves are held parallel along the stem. And you'll see that with maple, ash, dogwood. There is an exception to the dogwoods, and that is Cornice Alternifolia. So it's right there in the Latin, right? Alternate foliage. And you'll see those wild in the Catskills, and you'll see them planted at the Arboretum. So that's why we want to mention that exception. Horse chestnuts and buckeyes are also opposite. The family Caprifoliaceae, which is oppositely branched, contains trees that are hardy to this area. You'll also see those planted, they're opposite. Nistera, you'll see them planted in this area, they're opposite. Symphorocarpos, which is snowberry, we have planted at the Arboretum. And Dichotomous Key is bush honeysuckle. It's a small colonizing shrub, and that is opposite. And that is native to the mountains here in the Catskills, and it's planted at the Arboretum, especially around the education center. So those are all opposite, and you'll be able to test your ID on those at the Arboretum. Alternate is when buds take turns on each side as they emerge from a stem. An example from our woods would be oaks, birches, and willows. They're going to have more of a habit like that, but we'll see some pictures of this. This is a lot of terms. Pictures are a lot more helpful. And we have whorled branching. Think pine trees. So let's go on and look at some pictures. In the upper left-hand corner, we see our whorled branching. On the right here, we can see this is an ash bud. We can see our terminal bud here. On the side, our lateral buds or axillary buds. You know, botanists, I think, get carried away with some terms, and sometimes, you know, one thing might have 2 or 3 technical terms that people want to use. So I'm trying to keep that to a minimum for this, actually. Here we can see our big leaf scar, and we can see these little dots here with our vascular bundles. And these white dots are lenticels. Lenticels are important in respiration for a tree. Unfortunately, a lot of plants have lenticels. A lot of trees have lenticels, so it's not as helpful as I would like it to be. And here we can see this is an example of alternate branching. And we have the scar from the previous season's terminal bud scales right here. So if you're trying to figure out how much your trees grow in a year, you can look at that and figure it out. It's kind of fun when you have a twig and you can count back 3, 4, 5 years and see how much has grown. All right, and I've dedicated a slide to terminal buds because they can be a little bit confusing. So a terminal bud is a bud present at the very end of a twig. This can be tricky as many times a bud may be to the side of or below a leaf scar. If the terminal bud is to the side of or below a leaf scar, it would say terminal bud absent in an ID guide. The terminal bud location is used in identification guides and keys for winter tree ID. So we've got 4 plants here and 4 different sort of types of terminal buds. Here we've got a beech tree, and you can see the leaf scar here is actually below the terminal bud, and this is alternate. So this would be terminal bud present. We've got our ash with a very clear terminal bud. Over here, this is an Australia twig, and this little piece coming off, while it's actually dead, it held last year's seeds. This pushes the terminal bud off to the side, so this would be terminal bud absent in an ID guide. And here we have a linden. And honestly, I would have a hard time with that one in an ID guide if I was working on it. But I will say in this presentation, just looking at that arrangement again, most useful thing here is this zigzag. When you're looking at twigs, some of them have that alternate buds, and they have a very drastic zigzag to the leaf. And that's really helpful when you're trying to ID a zigzag to the stem, to the twig. That's really helpful when you're trying to ID things like lindens and red buds. You can see that and you can right away know what it is. For this presentation, I haven't talked about pith at all. It's just something I don't have a lot of experience with, but what is helpful is talking about size and how they refer to buds and twig size. When an ID guide is referring to a twig as stout, they're really saying it could be a fairly thin twig. It's that the buds in scale with that are much, much smaller. So the buds are going to be much smaller relative to the twig size. When they're saying a twig is slender, it could be a fairly chunky twig, but the buds relative to its size are going to be huge. So it's really more about bud to twig relativity there. And I think that might be the end of our key terms. Yes, it is. So we're going to move over to looking at some trees or some twigs. We've got Acer Pennsylvanicum, moose maple, or striped maple. It's called moose maple because herbivores like to eat the buds in winter, which is especially frustrating as a horticulturalist. Thank God we don't have moose, or not too many in this area, but deer do like to eat the buds. The twigs have a dark, smooth, flat bark. And depending on the condition, these twigs can be cranberry to almost black in color. The buds are opposite. They're covered in 2 bud scales. So you can see the little lateral buds here. It's got a nice big clear terminal bud. It's got 2 bud scales. And these scales start spreading in early winter. And you don't get to see the leaf, but you just get this really shiny silver pubescence on the leaves as they start to emerge in spring. And it's a really pretty thing to see in the forest. And I have a caveat here. In 2019, in late 2019, the Arboretum came out with a book, 21 Trees. They hired a photographer, Rob Cardillo, and he took a lot of great photos of a lot of trees that I was going to talk about in this presentation. So I've got a lot of really good pictures from a professional photographer because he's going to take better photos than I can. So you're going to see a lot of pictures with that photo credit there. So he did a very good job. And here we are looking at the opposite nature and the cranberryness, really, of the Acer Pennsylvanicum again. And here we are looking at the bark, and this is really why it's called striped maple. And the young growth has this green and brown striped bark, and this is why horticulturalists love it. I understand foresters can be pretty frustrated by it because these tend to form really dense carpets in the forest, and they can actually inhibit the growth of other tree species because they're so dense. But as a gardener, I love this for its unusual bark, for its unusual leaf, for it being an understory tree. And here you can see the opposite branching again. And as that tree ages, the bark down low is going to change, and you're going to get this gray gray bark with vertical striping. And if you want to see that beautiful green bark, you're just going to have to look up a little bit higher. But this is really going to happen on much older striped maples. And we're on to Acer Rubrum, which is red maple. The twigs are opposite, as you can see here. They're slender red or gray twigs. If it's growing really vigorously, I think you're going to see a little bit more red. If it's a little bit of a slower growth, I think you're going to see some more gray. They have no odor when broken. A lot of trees have a specific odor that is unique to them, and you can train your nose to sniff out trees when you scratch them. And it can be quite a useful ID feature. The buds would be called broad, blunt-pointed buds in clusters. Now, these broad, blunt-pointed buds are so big, you can really see them when you're 40 feet underneath the tree. You can look up and you can see those big knobby clustered buds in the tree, and you can know immediately, is that a red maple? Or you can know immediately it is a red maple. And that's good because when the bark is young, or when the tree is young, you have this flat silver bark, this smooth silver bark. And it looks fairly similar to a young sugar maple, and it looks fairly similar to a beech tree when it's young. So it can be a little bit confusing at that life stage. But the buds up in the canopy are a really good ID feature. Now, let's see, as the bark or as the tree ages, the bark begins forming these vertical plates. This is an extremely adaptable tree, and it can be found from swamps to mountaintops. It does prefer wet conditions, but I've got fairly sandy soil, and I still have them growing here. They're a very tough tree. And they're also a little bit more of a pioneer tree where areas are being let go. You will find red maple seeding in and growing in those areas pretty well. And as that vertical bark ages, and as the tree ages, on certain members of the species, that vertical bark can begin peeling away, forming this beautiful sort of exfoliating nature of it. And you can see the striped maple behind it over here. So that's the leaf of the striped maple. Now, there's a lot of diversity in red maple bark. And in one forest, you might see, you know, red maples that look like this and some that look like the previous picture I showed you with just the vertical plates. So there's a fair amount of diversity in that gene pool. And we're going to look at sugar maples. Acer saccharum, sugar maples, pretty easy to remember.
Ryan?
Yes.
Can you go back to that picture? Somebody wrote, isn't that a hickory? So I think that's a good trick question.
It is a good trick question. It's one you posed to me when I started. No, that's a red maple, actually. It does look like a shagbark hickory, but the bark is different and the leaf is different, and you'll see it in person if you actually go to the red maple trail at the Arboretum, and that tree is going to be on the native tree trail, which we're going to be releasing in spring. So you'll actually be able to go see it and double check us.
And one thing is that the, I forget if you said that, I was typing to somebody else, but this is an opposite branched. You could see the opposite branching. Maybe you said that already. A hickory is alternate branched. So that's a way you would tell them apart.
Yeah. And I mean, you would be able to see the difference in the buds too, even from down below, you'd be able to look up and see those clustered buds. Hickories have, if I recall correctly, they've got pretty chunky but very simple buds, not like the clustered buds of the maple.
Yeah, they're compound leaf, so they have those big, really big buds.
Yeah, yeah. All right, and back to sugar maples. Once again, this is opposite, and it has slender maple syrup colored twigs. The buds are very narrow, sharp pointed, brown buds with many scales. The terminal buds are much larger than the laterals, and it is the official state tree of New York. All right, let's look at the bark here. The young bark is much like the Acer Rubrum and the beech trees, but you can look up and you can see the canopies once again, and you can figure out which is which. And the beech buds look drastically different, and we will look at that. One good way to tell the difference here is the bark. Now in this stage here, this is not a very mature sugar maple. It can be a little bit difficult, but those vertical plates that form, or the bark furrows into long irregular plates, it's the fact that those lift along just one edge that's a good ID feature. And here we're going to see a mature sugar maple trunk, and you can see each piece of bark is just really lifted along one edge. Now, the family Betulaceae comprises several different genus and species that you can find in our area. And it can actually, when I was making this, I was a little surprised by how difficult it could be to tell the difference between them with twigs, and also how none of these would be deemed in an ID guide to have terminal buds. So I wanted to compare and contrast these in one slide and talk a little bit about the family in general. So Betula, Carpinus, and Australia are all in the family Betulaceae, or Betulaceae. They have similar buds, reproductive structures, and no terminal buds. So their reproductive structures are these catkins over here. They all have lenticels present on twigs and branches. They're all alternate, and all their leaves have a similar shape, and they all have a serrated margin. So the really great way to tell them all apart is, in my humble opinion, bark. It's always visible, and it's not hidden in a distant canopy. So first we're going to look at Betula alleghaniensis, or yellow birch. The twigs are yellow-brown in color. They're often hairy. According to the book, now I did not find that through the trees that I looked at the Arboretum. They do have a slight wintergreen flavor, but you really have to chew them for a few seconds to confirm that. And I think it's more fun to look at the bark rather than chew the twig.
Hey, Ryan?
Yes.
We have a couple of questions about terminal buds.
Yeah.
One was, there's two questions. One was about the striped maple going way back, because one photo looked like it had one terminal bud and the other looked like it had two. I have a feeling it's because probably one terminal bud fell off, which you always have to look for. Whenever you're IDing, you have to look around the tree a lot and not just go to one spot. And I have a feeling that there are probably two terminal buds on the striped maple, and maybe one fell off. I don't know.
I have, well, it's that the terminal bud might have been eaten off at one point, and then those two buds that were probably lateral buds became two terminal buds.
Oh, I see.
Because even yesterday I was walking around in the forest looking at the striped maples, and they all primarily have one terminal bud with lateral buds, but being that they're an understory tree and they do like to form sort of dense carpets, and they do get eaten a lot by deer. Yeah, I think that those lateral buds became terminal buds. But yeah, it can be tricky to sometimes deal with opposite and alternate, even because let's say a tree is opposite and one bud fails or whatever happens, or the tree aborts growth on that branch. Now it's going to look alternate, you know? So it can be a little bit tricky to figure all that out. But it's you really have to take a broad sampling from a tree. Okay. And this Betula alleghaniensis is a perfect example of why you have to take a broad sample from a tree. Because when you see this picture down here on the bottom right, this doesn't count as a terminal bud here, according to an ID guide. And this tiny thin twig is attached to this larger twig through what I'll show you later, which was a terminal bud, but it's a terminal bud that's off to the side. It's a little bit confusing, and that's why I spend a lot of time in this presentation on bark. So the twigs are yellow-brown in color. They're often hairy. We went through that. So the buds are alternate along the stems, and they have catkins as flowering buds. So if you're ever in question, is this a birch or is this a cherry or what have you, you can look up and you can see catkins in the canopy. You're gonna at least be able to rule that it's the family Betulaceae. Right. So that twig that I showed up top with a bud.
There's another question about tapping birch trees. I know this isn't a tapping class, but people asked about which variety of birch might be best to tap. I don't know if you know that. I don't know the answer.
I don't know. I don't know, but I would love to try it myself, and that's something I'd like to do in the future. And if Sandra's watching this presentation, if she can comment down below, that would be helpful, because she's going to know way more about that than I am. And she signed up, so we'll see. So here we have on this twig the bud scales from what was a terminal bud, and you can see all these bud scars here, because this counts as a terminal bud. And then this twig grew out and then grew into that tiny thin one that was up in the top presentation. So there's the birches were a little bit confusing to really go through and try and categorize them by bud, and they have these unusual spur-like structures. It's not a spur. Spur is a modified twig that's used for different purposes, like in apple trees it holds flower buds, and other trees it's just for protection, like in honey locusts or black locusts. But here, these terminal buds kind of just linger like this until they begin branching out. What really sets Betula alleghaniensis apart, as many birches, is their beautiful bark. And when you see this bark in the woods, you know exactly what you've got. So we're going to see a few more pictures. So the young stems are bright silvery and yellow-gray in color. With age, they peel into thin, papery layers, and the old trunks become reddish-brown in color. The older exfoliating bark can eventually peel away, revealing plates. Now, the plates that you see on the right, that is in the forest at the Arboretum. And I think you're only going to see that on a tree that's probably getting closer to 100 years old. And these trees can live, many birch trees are short-lived, but yellow birch can live to 100 or older. So for a birch tree to begin getting plates like that, it's been there a long time. And that's not something you see very often. Betula papyrifera, paper birch or white birch. On young stems, the bark is golden to reddish brown in color, and as it matures, the bark becomes chalky white and it peels off in thin papery layers. Older peeling bark eventually grows into the same plates that we saw on the last slide. Let's look at some buds here. The twigs are stout, dull reddish brown in color. The terminal bud is absent, has small lateral buds. They're sharp pointed and they bend away from the twig. And next year's flower buds are present as catkins. Now, this says that the buds are, well, I don't think it says what color they are. Well, depending on the temperature of the year or what fluctuations you've had in winter, the buds can be brown, but if you've had a few warm days or a week of warm weather before it snapped cold again, they'll turn green and they'll stay green for the rest of winter until spring. So there is that little bit of variation, but the bark is a really good ID feature, and as are the catkins. And the buds do look marginally different between the different birch species. Here we can see more of this beautiful Betula papyrifera bark. And general birch identifiers are the catkins, alternate buds on twigs with lenticels, and over here on the left, that's actually the seed structure for the birch. And I know that in December, it's still on the tree and you can still see that. So at least in early winter, that seed structure is still there. Actually, if you look underneath a birch tree in the snow, you'll see all these little brown seeds attached to these little paper wings underneath it. All right, we're looking at Carpinus caroliniana, or Mussel Wood, which is American.
Ryan?
Yes. Yes.
There's a question, I think you're about to answer it too. Are birch trees the only trees that have catkins? And somebody also asked, and I didn't answer it correctly. I mean, I did the wrong thing in terms of tech, but no, I haven't seen a shaggy red maple that shaggy outside of the Arboretum. I've Googled it and I've seen it on Google on really, really old ones, but not on one that is that small. Oh, we have an answer from Alexandra Prince.
Thank you.
Regarding tapping, thank you, Xander. Regarding tapping birches, I know people who tap all kinds of birches, white, yellow, black. They each have slightly different flavor profiles. Be warned though, you need 100+ gallons of birch sap to make just 1 gallon of birch syrup, versus sugar maple, which is more around 40 to 50 gallons of sap to 1 gallon of syrup. Thanks, Xander. Thanks for the warning.
Yeah, that sounds like a lot of work.
Yeah. Take it away, Ryan.
All right. Oh, and no, you can find catkins on other trees as well, I believe. Yeah. I mean, Mark, you might know this too. Do willows count as having catkins as well?
I think so. I think willows count. And you're about to go into Carpinus and, yeah, the alder has catkins also.
Yeah.
Yeah, so other trees have catkins.
Yeah.
And shrubs.
So Carpinus caroliniana, Mussel Wood. The twigs are slender, they're dark red, and they're shiny. It has no terminal bud. It has small lateral buds that are narrowly ovate, pointed, and covered in many reddish-brown scales. This charming understory tree can often be found near waterways in a forest. And this is why it's called Mussel Wood, and this is why it's so easy to ID it from its bark. It has a smooth, thin, blue-gray bark tightly gripping the vertically ridged trunk that resembles tensed muscles. And it often has these low, horizontally spreading branches that give it a really graceful, sort of delicate habit in a forest. And I put this in here because we're going to look at another twig, and it's going to have this old stem on it. I think we saw it earlier, this old stem on it. So the fruit, and you can see these in fall. These don't ripen until fall. So you can still see them in fall and early winter, these old seed structures on the Carpinus. The fruit is a small ribbed nutlet enclosed in a 3-lobed leaf bract. The bracts and nutlets are in long drooping clusters that ripen in fall, and they drop in, I'd say, early winter. And they're very, very charming. And I think these little curiosities are what make horticulturalists love them. And we're looking at Ostraya virginiana, which is hop hornbeam. Once again, it's actually related to Carpinus. It's in the family Betulaceae. The bark is thin gray-brown bark that peels away in flat, narrow, vertical strips. Has fine reddish-brown, or the twigs are fine, reddish-brown in color, smooth and shiny. The terminal bud is absent. The lateral buds are small. They're light reddish-brown in color, and they bend away from the twig. Now, the fact they bend away from the twig is actually quite helpful. And this is a slow-growing understory tree. You won't often see this beyond like 10 or 12 inches in diameter. But the bark is such a different texture that it contrasts with the rest of the forest, and you can you can pick these out from 100 feet away. And here we're looking at the twigs and the variation in them. You can see the catkins over here, and you can see that old structure for the seeds over there. I think we talked about that info, so I'm not going to go back over it. And this is what the seeds look like, or the seed pods look like. This small seed, like nutlet, is enclosed in an inflated sac, like bracts. These bracts resemble hops, hence the name hop hornbeam. And these ripen as well in fall, and you should be able to see them in early winter. Moving on to Fagus grandifolia, or American beech. This is the seed pod. It's got little beech nuts inside it, and that's very distinctive. The bark is a hard, smooth, silver bark. The twigs are slender gray twigs with alternate buds and branching. I find the bud scales on the twigs to actually be beautiful. It's one of my favorite things. Marquescence is the term that means holding the leaves until the new growth pushes them off in spring. You'll see this especially on young trees, on young beech trees. And if you're ever in a beech forest when it's snowing, the sound of the snow on the beech leaves is fantastic. And it has a three-sided, slightly spiky seed pod that contains the small beech nuts. And here we can see the bark of the beech tree. This is at the Woodland Walk at the Arboretum. And I think I mentioned it, but we'll talk about that in a minute. The many-scaled, long, pointy buds are alternately borne along the stems, and they do count as having terminal buds. And over here on the right, you can actually see the bud scales very well from the terminal bud from previous season's growth. Little things like that, or like when the tree gets covered in ice like that, it's just why I love beech buds. They're just, in my opinion, the buds are, the scales on the bud are symmetrical, and they're absolutely beautiful. And this is an example of marquescence. As the leaves age, they turn from a brown to this like parchment yellow color, and they rattle in the wind and the snow hits them, and it's very, very fun.
Hey, Ryan.
Yes.
Somebody has a question that they're still not getting what counts as a terminal bud and what doesn't.
Yeah, so the terminal bud is if it's at the very end of the twig, it counts as being a terminal bud. If the terminal bud is slightly pushed off to the side or below a leaf scar, then it is not a terminal bud. So when we look at this, you can see a pretty clear terminal bud. The leaf scar is not pushing these buds out of the way. Unfortunately, I don't have a better picture of that. The terminal bud is not pushing them out of the way, but when you look at, and it's hard to see it in the beech trees because their leaf scars are so, not beech trees, the birch trees, because their leaf scars are so small. But they're buds that are at the end of their twigs. They're actually pushed off a little bit to the side, and they're a little bit under the leaf scar. And it took me a lot of looking at twigs to really be able to say, that's got a terminal bud, that's a terminal bud absent. But if you spend, 2 hours looking at twigs, you're gonna have it down, if that's something you care to spend 2 hours on. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks.
Fraxinus Americana. Oh no. White ash. The twigs are brittle. They're stout, smooth, shining, and gray-brown. They're stout because they have this big leaf here. This is one leaf. This is the petiole. These are individual leaflets. And this is what is known as a pinnately compound leaf. This leaves a big leaf scar. And when you have big leaves, I feel like you do tend to get, big chunky twigs. This has opposite buds and branching. And this is actually related to olives and has a similar flower and seed structure as olive trees. What I think there's two good ways to ID Fraxinus. One is the diamond patterned bark, which you can see over here on the right. This dark gray-brown, furrowed with narrow, flat-topped firm ridges. It does become scaly on old trunks, but these fissures tend to run together, creating diamond-shaped fissures or diamond pattern. So you can see that, especially over here, you can see this diamond pattern. And you can look at the trees in the forest, and if it's got that really clear diamond pattern, it sticks out, and you know you've got an ash tree. The second thing is they have a very coarse texture when you're down low and you're looking up at a big tree. Because they have such big leaves and they have such big twigs, they have a very coarse texture, and you'll be able to see that when you're looking up. And just for context, that's a 12-inch ruler on the right, and that's one ash twig. So that they're big. They're a big, chunky twig. And you can see the opposite buds and branching with the one large terminal bud and the smaller lateral buds covered with a few scales. And you can see that big leaf scar there. All right. I actually practiced saying the species name on this because it's kind of a hard word. Grandidentata, Populus grandidentata, or big tooth aspen. Unfortunately, we have several of these trees at the Arboretum, but I could not find any where I could reach the buds. So this is our open source photo for this, which is sad because it does not have the terminal bud here. It's stout, round, reddish or yellowish brown in color in early winter, often pale and downy twigs, and has a more pronounced yellow color than quaking aspen. The buds, the terminal bud is present, not in this picture, but the lateral buds generally bend away from the twig. There is a very good way to ID this, and that is the bark. The bark on the trunk, on the lower trunk, is gray and much more deeply furrowed than quaking aspen. This gray, deeply furrowed bark is very clear and when you walk through the forest. And now we're going to look at the twig of the quaking aspen. I'm going to check my time here. Okay. Populus tremuloides, quaking aspen. The twigs are smooth, shiny, reddish brown in color. The terminal buds are about 1/4 inch long, narrow, conical. They're often curved, sharp pointed, shiny, and reddish brown in color. And I think it has a green apple herbal smell when scratched. The ID guide said it had a rank smell, but I've smelled a lot of plants and I don't think this one was too rank. Great way to ID this is the trunk. Now, as these get really old, the bark will become darker, but for what I could find, you have these flat-topped gray ridges with these dark black furrows in between. And the old trunks have these broad, flat ridges. We're going to see some young ones here. That beautiful sort of whitish yellow, light colored bark is what you're going to see up top if it's got those dark ridges down below. And if it's a younger tree, this is what you're going to see. And they're beautiful and they really stand out. So Populus tremuloides can spread through root sprouts. So if you have one tree or a couple big trees, one thing that can happen is if it comes down or it gets unhealthy or whatever, it's under environmental stress, or maybe it's just really happy, it'll basically, that one tree can colonize an area. So rather than being all individual trees, these are all hooked up with one central root system and they are colonizing an area. And beech trees can do the same thing. So if I've seen this at, well, at the Arboretum and also at a few other gardens, if a beech tree dies or something happens, it will colonize an entire area with these sprouts. And eventually these sprouts can grow up and become mature trees, and you've got a big ring of mature trees. All right, Prunus Serratina, or black cherry. Not only is this great for wildlife because it does produce these berries, little cherry fruits.
Right.
Yes.
Questions.
Yeah.
Are quaking aspen a weak tree like poplar and fell easily in strong storms?
Yeah, they are. Yeah, they're definitely a pioneer tree. They grow in rough soils that have, say you had a field that was being hayed, it'd been, really deprived of good nutrition and all of that, and it got let go. You would have things like birches and poplars coming in because they can survive those really tough conditions. They grow fast, they die young, and they are fairly weak wooded. And what speaks to that is this is really used for pulp products, in like cheap furniture and things like that. It's not used in furniture or anything like that. It's a soft, weak wood.
And then somebody has a question. So I think I'm not sure what this is relation to. Maybe to the fact, maybe you talked about them suckering. You cannot transplant just one of the smaller ones.
Oh, I mean, I don't know. Is that a statement or a question? And I haven't tried transplanting them. If it was a smaller one and it was alone, like not near anybody, I would give it a go. But I have tried transplanting basically plants that were like suckering from other ones. And without that nutrient feed from their parent plant, I think their survival rate is much lower.
Okay, thanks. I think if it grew, if it happens to be growing from seed, then it would be easy. Then I don't know if it would be easy, but I think that it would be, I think they're in the willow family, which means that they would probably have a lot of good hormones for taking off on their own. But
I think they'd be much more successful if it was from seed. Yeah.
Usually you'd find it as we talked about, suckering.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yep. All right. Prunus Seratina, black cherry. This, however, is a very high value wood because of its beautiful color and its strength. So the young trees are smooth, reddish brown in color. They have long, light, white horizontal lenticels. The bark looks like this, and it's basically just a larger version of this on bigger trees up until a certain point. The twigs are slender, smooth, reddish brown. They have a strange taste and smell. I think they smell like a bitter green pepper or green beans. Some people say bitter almonds, but they do have a bitter sort of off-putting smell. It's a great way to differentiate them from birch trees because they can look pretty similar when they're young, before each develops their very characteristic bark. They start growth in rich woodlands before they become heavily shaded. They're often found on roadsides or bordering farm fields. They're often accompanied by a mix of oaks, pine, and hemlock, and they're not tolerant of deep shade. So if you've got a mature forest and it's got a lot of shade, you're not going to be putting anything young in there like these cherries, which I've spent a lot of time thinking about myself. The buds are 1/8 to a 16th or to a 1/6 of an inch long. They're very small, sharp pointed, chestnut brown in color with a terminal bud present. And you can see the leaf scar over here off to the side underneath the bud. And this is the bark on the mature tree. This really stands out in a forest. And I find that these trees do tend to sort of bend and weave around other trees. So they oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes have these very curved trunks to go along with it. And you have these rough, irregular, dark, scaly, circular plates on the trees. And here you can see the old bark with its horizontal lenticels peeling away, and you can see the new scaly bark coming in. All right, we're at Tilia Americana, or American basswood. The twigs are smooth, gray to red-brown, and they have a distinctive zigzag caused by the alternating buds. The buds are alternate with no terminal buds. So this is one of those ones where I find it can be a little bit confusing, the terminal bud issue. There's large lateral buds. They're dark red or green in color, and the buds bend away from the twig. And here's the bark in two different life cycles. It's relatively flat gray bark with these little furrows in it when it's young. And the older trees have shallow furrows and the flat-topped ridges with the same dark gray, just a little bit shaggier, not quite as smooth. All right, that was the end of our trees. Now, Mark, I'm gonna leave this decision up to you. I can go over a dichotomous key, or we can do a Q&A. So it's up to you if you wanna go to Q&A now, or do we do this?
I wonder if we can vote. Who wants to do, you can raise your hand. Who wants to do a dichotomous tree? There's a little red, oh, we got lots of, I'm seeing lots of yeses. And while people are voting, somebody said, I was told it is the smell, with the black cherry, is the smell of cyanide. Maybe don't chew it. I don't think we should tell people.
No, that's entirely true.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's entirely true. And I was reading about this, that the black cherries, because they do often come up in old farm fields and on the border of pastures, and that smell is cyanide. It's like the same coating that's inside an apple seed, right? There's a little bit of cyanide in the coating of an apple seed. Well, there's cyanide in the cherries, and it's in the same family of Prunus, or the cherry family. Apples are in there, cherries are in there, roses are in there. But anyway, yeah, it is cyanide, and they are poisonous. I wouldn't chew the twig, and apparently they're toxic to animals in large numbers, and apparently one of the leading killers of livestock in the United States. Go figure.
Although I wouldn't be scared of it. I mean, I have bit into it and to see if it tasted as nasty, and I've spit it out. I'm not recommending that you do it, but
adventurous.
Well, you eat apple seeds by accident sometimes too.
Yeah, it's not gonna.
Somebody asked, can you send a list of trees that have odor and what that odor is, of the ones we discussed? Or is there a guide that would tell us that? I've not noted that in guides I've read. Thanks. So that's from an anonymous attendee.
Yeah. I can send you a list of what I know of that has an odor and that smells and how that's like what that IDs. But yeah, it's not mentioned in guides that often, and I can send that to you. I can send you at least a list of everything I know. And
Ryan's email is ryan@mtarboretum.org, or you can send it to info@mtarboretum.org. So basically, a lot of people raise their hands.
Yeah, let's go through a dichotomous key. And I actually have the link to this dichotomous key that I used in this presentation. At the bottom, it's free. It covers the 50 most common trees in New York State, and it has a summer ID key and it has a winter ID key. So it's very helpful. And I have the link at the end of the presentation. And if people want it, I can email it to the link to people as well. All right. So this was a Populus tremuloides twig here. Probably shouldn't have said that, but I did. Anyway, a dichotomous key is a key that gives you a choice between two options. So we're going to get started. You're hopefully going to get how this works through doing it. It's kind of a weird way for me to explain it. Option 1. Are the leaves persistent and green throughout the winter? No. So leaves are deciduous, not remaining on the tree throughout the winter. That is correct. Do the twigs have lateral wart-like branches? They do not. So we're here. Twigs lacking lateral wart-like branches. Which three are we now? Arrangement of branches, leaf scars, and buds are opposite. It is not. It is alternate. The arrangement of branches, leaf scars, and buds is alternate. All right, so we go to that 3, and we're going to read what we have as our options next. Arrangement of branches, leaf scars, and buds is alternate. Is the terminal bud absent? The first lateral bud may seem terminal, but is not. I looked carefully at this, and even over here, I can see the leaf scars off to the side, and it's below the bud. So I say the buds are terminal. Even though it's alternate, the buds are terminal. So the terminal bud is present, and it's either surrounded by a cluster of buds or it's born singly. Well, ours is born singly. And then it says terminal bud surrounded by, no. So we're not at a cluster of buds, there's no acorns, we're not in the oaks. Terminal bud is born singly. However, it's not a birch, we're not confused. All right. Do the buds have 3 to 4 dark brown smooth outer scales spreading away from, no, because it doesn't have bark peeling away in long strips. Bud is variously colored with a various number of scales, flattened against the twig. These are pushed against the twig there, or spreading. The bark is tight and not peeling. Yep. Our choices, are the buds covered with close-fitting woolly scales? No. Bud scales are smooth and not woolly. All right. Do the buds have 2 scales united with a cap? Nope, it is not tulip. It is not a tulip tree. Buds with more than 2 scales. Let's see. No. The bud does have more than 2 scales, but it does not have the wintergreen flavor or aroma, and it does not have spur-like laterals. The twigs lacking wintergreen flavor and aroma. Yep, that is true. It does not have a wintergreen aroma, it has a different aroma. The lateral buds are smaller than the terminal buds. So we're down here, 33. See what our options are. Well, it's aromatic, but it's not spicy, so it's not sassafras. Bark and twigs odorless or with a bitter almond odor, not spicy. Well, they definitely have a weird odor, but I'm not going to say it's bitter almond. Yeah, twigs odorless or the bitter. All right. We're not looking at the cherries. Twigs lacking the bitter almond odor. There we go. Twigs lacking the bitter almond odor. Now, when I tested this, the twig was not brittle, but it did have a rank odor when broken. This is the one that I thought smelled kind of like green apples. Are the lateral buds flattened against the twigs? The twigs are slender and red-brown. It's all true. Then it is quaking aspen. That's how you go through an ID guide. I think it's a little easier when they use, A, B, C rather than numbers, because this gets a little bit confusing to me. But basically, you're always presented with 2 choices, and you pick the one that most resembles what you're looking at. And many of the pictures that I used were from Rob Cardillo. He worked on our book, 21 Trees. And yeah, it's about the Arboretum, local geology, forest history, the 21 trees that were used in the building, the 21 tree species used in the building of our education center. And if you want to find out more about this stuff, you can check out our book. And this year we will be opening a native tree trail. All of the trees in this presentation will be on it. And this will be a great way to see the Arboretum and learn about the trees of the region. So thank you for being here. Let me know if you have any questions. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Ryan. Thanks. That was great. I learned so much. Let me see. if there are other questions. People are saying thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you. Let's see. Is the Arboretum open?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It's a little hard to get into the woodland walk because the gate is frozen under like 3 feet of snow. But all of the Arboretum's open, and we have so many snowshoers and we have so many hikers that the trail is really actually nicely packed down. If you step off the trail, you might sink hip deep, but you know, you can pretty much walk on top of the snow if you're going out to Spruce Glen or something like that.
Great. Somebody asked, where can we find 21 trees? It's for sale at, there's a store in town in Tannersville called Sundry. Deer Mountain Inn is selling it. We're going to start at Scribner's has it, which is also local. You can mail us a check and we can mail it to you, and we hope soon to have it up on Amazon. Thank you. Great informative talk.
Hi, Katie. I'm going to say hi to my family. Hi, Katie, Mom, Dad, Luke, Logan, Chris, and Charlie.
I missed this part of the discussion, Ryan.
Mm-hmm.
What are the possible reasons for macrescence? I don't remember what that is. What do scientists speculate?
You know, all I've heard is hearsay, and you know, hearsay is often not admissible in court, so I'm not willing to comment on exactly what causes marquescence. But oaks sometimes have it, beeches have it. You'll actually see Carpinus holding on to their leaves, especially down in the lower areas of the canopy.
Oh, that's what that is, holding on to their leaves. Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Everybody's saying thank you, thank you, thank you. What town is the Arboretum near? Tannersville, Hunter. Tannersville. Great. It is 11:02. You timed that perfectly. I want to thank everyone for attending. Ryan, thank you. I learned so much too. And we hope you can all visit. Here's the timber frame education center behind me at the office. The building is still closed because of COVID and the restrooms are closed, but if you bring snowshoes, I walked out to the Hidden Marsh yesterday and it was so beautiful. It's just gorgeous. The snow is beautiful. The snow on all the conifers in there is gorgeous. So come visit and have a great weekend. Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good one.